Have you ever walked into a room and noticed the one person who says nothing, yet everyone watches them? That's not a coincidence. Influence doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it waits. In a world addicted to noise, silence becomes power. We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, talking louder, faster, more often. But the Stoics believed the opposite. The man who masters himself doesn't need to prove anything. His presence is enough. Influence isn't about words. It's about energy. It's about posture, breath, awareness. The quiet man who is in control of his mind and emotions doesn't chase attention. He commands it by doing nothing more than being still. That stillness forces others to adjust around him. It creates space, and space is where power lives. Most people speak from insecurity. They react, they explain, they justify. But silence says, I don't need your approval. I'm already at peace with myself. This is not passivity. It's dominance through discipline. Because when you stop needing to be understood, you free yourself from the trap of explaining, defending, and seeking validation. And in that space, people lean in. They start to wonder what you're thinking. They fill in the blanks with respect. That's where real influence begins. Not from what you say, but from what you withhold. The Stoics taught that restraint is not weakness, but wisdom. When you choose silence over reaction, you're not backing down, you're stepping above. Because every time you react emotionally, you surrender control. You give away your power. But when you remain still, when you hold the line, people feel it. They begin to see that you're operating on a different level, one that doesn't answer to provocation, approval, or chaos. We often think influence comes from saying the right thing. But real power comes from saying nothing until it's necessary. And when it is, you speak with impact, not impulse. You speak after thinking, not before. That's the difference between the loud and the respected. The loud seek attention. The respected don't need it. There's a calmness that comes from knowing you don't have to perform. You don't need to explain your values, prove your strength, or defend your choices. When you're grounded in your own principles, your silence becomes a signal. It says, I don't need to argue. I'm already clear. I've already chosen who I am. That kind of clarity is magnetic. People don't just listen to you, they watch you. They study your stillness because they want that same composure for themselves. In silence, you reveal nothing, and that makes people uncertain. Uncertainty creates curiosity. Curiosity builds tension, and tension, when used correctly, becomes presence. That's why the silent one often controls the room without trying. Not because he demands attention, but because he doesn't chase it. He lets others reveal themselves first. He listens, he watches, he studies what others miss in their rush to be heard. The Stoics understood that most conversations are not about truth, they're about ego. One person tries to prove they're smarter, louder, stronger. The other tries to defend, react, correct. But the Stoic doesn't enter that game. He remains still. And in doing so, he exposes how little others actually control themselves. When you stay quiet, you don't lose ground. You gain leverage. Because you've shown that your emotions aren't easily triggered, that your self-worth isn't up for negotiation. You begin to influence not by force, but by gravity. People notice when you don't flinch. When you're unshaken by drama, insult, or expectation, they begin to question their own noise. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting their instability, their need to speak, their lack of control. And the more they see it, the more they respect you. Because power that doesn't need to speak is the kind of power people fear, admire, and trust. Subscribe and hit the bell. Because true growth starts with what you choose to hear. The power of silence lies in its discipline. Anyone can speak. Few can stay silent when it matters. When you're insulted, misunderstood, or challenged, Your instinct is to respond. But the Stoic pauses. He asks, will my words bring value, or are they just a reaction? If it's the latter, he holds back. Because reacting may win the moment, but restraint wins the war. The war over your emotions, over your mind, over how much of yourself you give away. People underestimate how loud silence can be. It makes others uncomfortable. It forces them to sit with their own thoughts. And in that discomfort, your presence grows. You haven't said a word, but you've shifted the dynamic. That's not passive energy. It's strategic. That's not insecurity. It's self-possession. You show others that your state of mind doesn't depend on their words, that your identity isn't up for discussion. This is how real influence is built. Not on what you show, but on what you withhold. Not on performance, but on control. You become the person who doesn't flinch, doesn't beg to be heard, doesn't rise to every challenge. And because of that, your words carry more weight when you finally speak. Because you've proven that silence is your default. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you choose when it matters most. Every environment you enter is filled with noise. People competing to be heard, to be right, to be validated. But the Stoic doesn't compete in that arena. He doesn't raise his voice to win. He doesn't explain himself to feel seen. He simply exists in full command of his space, grounded in who he is, and that alone shifts the atmosphere. People may not understand it at first, but they feel it. They feel the discipline, the focus, the silence that speaks louder than ego ever could. When you choose silence, you also choose patience. You allow things to unfold without interference. You observe how people reveal themselves, not just through what they say, but how quickly they say it, how emotionally they respond, how much control they lose trying to be right. Meanwhile, you conserve your energy. You let others expend theirs, and by the end, you're still steady, still composed, still in control. That's why silence is a form of leadership. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that earns trust. People follow those who don't need to be followed. They listen to those who don't speak often. And when you've trained yourself to resist the urge to prove, defend, or react, you become exactly that kind of leader. The quiet presence that moves with clarity, purpose, and strength. Most people will never master silence because they're addicted to being seen, addicted to being right, addicted to noise. But the few who do, they operate on a different frequency. They don't argue, they don't chase, they don't over-explain. They lead without forcing, influence without noise. And when they speak, people listen, because it's rare, because it's earned, because it means something. You have a choice. Keep reacting like everyone else, or start living with the discipline to hold your ground, to speak less, to observe more, to be unmoved in the face of chaos and unshaken in the presence of ego. That's what makes a man truly powerful. Not how much he says, but how little he needs to. When was the last time your silence made someone rethink everything? Not your anger, not your arguments, just your stillness. If this made you think, subscribe now and hit the bell, because real power doesn't shout. It listens, waits, and moves with intention. Stay sharp, stay disciplined, stay silent when it matters most.